Another day, another broadcast. It's strange how time feels so slippery now, isn't it? The days don't have the same weight they used to. No morning rush to get somewhere. No evening wind down when it's all over. Just the same endless stretch of survival, one breath after another. And yet, here we are. You, me, whoever else might be out there clinging to the edges of this fractured world. It's not easy surviving. It's not supposed to be. That's the point, I think. The world now seems designed to grind us down, to see how much of ourselves we'll sacrifice just to make it through another day. And somehow you did. Somehow you're still here, breathing, listening. It might not feel like an accomplishment, but trust me, it is. This place, what's left of it, doesn't forgive mistakes. You only get this far by being sharp, by being lucky, or by sheer stubbornness. But let's not pretend it's just about dodging teeth and claws. That's the easy part, if you can believe it. The harder part is the quiet, the empty spaces between the fights and the running. That's when the weight really settles in. It's the silence that cuts the deepest, the stillness that makes you realize just how much has been lost. You feel it, don't you? That absence, like a hole punched straight through the world. The absence of voices, laughter, even the hum of traffic. Gone. All of it replaced by this unbearable quiet that sits in your chest and refuses to leave. I used to think I hated the noise back before. The constant buzz of everything, the pressure to keep moving, to keep up with whatever everyone else thought was important. Now, I'd give anything to hear it again. Car horn blaring, kids yelling as they play in the street, someone arguing over something trivial at the corner store. Those sounds don't belong to this world anymore. Now every sound is sharper, more focused. A branch snapping, a door creaking, the faint shuffle of footsteps that could mean salvation or death. And then there's the waiting. God, the waiting. The world we're in now isn't just dangerous. It's patient. It doesn't rush you. It lets you sit there and think. Lets you stew in your own thoughts until they turn against you. That's what makes surviving feel so heavy. It's not the infected, not the hunger or thirst. It's that you have to carry yourself through it, and there's no one else to share the load. No one to take the weight off your shoulders, even for a moment. Sometimes I wonder if that's the point of it all. If this world is testing us to see how much we can take before we break. Maybe that's what survival really is. Not living, not thriving, but refusing to break. Refusing to let the silence win. Every day you keep breathing, keep moving, is a small rebellion against a world that wants to bury you. But rebellion has a cost. You've felt it, haven't you? That gnawing exhaustion, the one that settles in your bones and whispers that it would be easier to stop. That maybe, just maybe, it's not worth it. I've heard that voice too. I think we all have. But here's the thing about that voice, it's a liar. Every time it tells you to stop, it's because you've already done the impossible. You've survived something that would break anyone else, and now it's trying to convince you to give up because it knows you can keep going. It knows you're stronger than it ever expected. You've already proven it, by the way. Just the fact that you're hearing this means you've done what most people couldn't. You've made it through the panic, the chaos, the collapse. You've seen the world tear itself apart, and you're still here. That's not nothing. That's not luck. That's resilience, and it's worth holding on to, even when everything else feels like it's slipping through your fingers. So, let me ask you something. What are you holding on to? What's that one thing, that one thought that keeps you moving when every part of you wants to stop? Maybe it's a memory, a promise you made to someone you lost. Maybe it's just a stubborn refusal to give this world the satisfaction of beating you. Whatever it is, don't let go of it. Not now, not ever, because that's the thing that will keep you alive when nothing else can. And don't think for a second that I'm just saying this for you. I need to hear it too. Every word I'm saying to myself as much as to you. We're all in this together, in a way. Alone, sure, but together in the same fight, the same struggle. That's why I keep doing this, broadcasting, talking into the void. Because as long as there's a chance someone out there is listening, it means I'm not the only one left fighting. Maybe that's what survival really is. Not just staying alive, but refusing to be alone in it. Refusing to let the silence take everything. So, here's the truth. If you're listening to this, you're already winning. You're already defying the odds. And that's enough for now. It has to be. There comes a time when the walls of your little world start closing in. The place you thought was safe, the ground you've memorized step by step, it starts to feel more like a cage than a sanctuary. That's when you know it's time to move. Not forever, just far enough to remind yourself what's still out there. That's what I did. Packed what little I needed and pushed past the invisible line I'd drawn around myself. The roads out there are barren. It's a strange kind of barren, though not the clean slate of untouched wilderness, but the kind that still carries the weight of the lives that used to move along them. Cars, frozen in place like tombstones, their doors open, contents spilled across the asphalt. Grocery bags still holding cans that no one ever got to eat. Shoes scattered like someone ran so fast they didn't notice when they lost them. It's a graveyard out there, in every sense of the word. I kept moving, sticking to the edges of the highway where the weeds have started to reclaim the pavement. The air smelled of earth and rock, a mix that's hard to ignore but impossible to escape. Every so often, I'd pass a sign, a billboard for a long-closed diner, a rusted street marker pointing toward a town no one calls home anymore. They're like whispers of the past, reminders of the life we all used to live, a life that feels more like a dream the further I get from it. The suburbs were worse. You'd think the quiet would feel safer, but it doesn't. It feels heavier, like the houses are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Windows stared at me as I passed, cracked and smeared with dirt, like lifeless eyes. Front yards were overgrown, fences leaning at odd angles. In some driveways, I saw bikes lying on their sides, half covered in leaves. I couldn't help but wonder if someone had been riding those bikes when it all started. Did they have time to drop them, or were they dragged away? I didn't go inside most of the houses. I've learned not to trust the places that look untouched. If it seems like no one's been there, it usually means something's lying in wait. But I did check a few garages. They're easier to retreat from if things go sideways. Found a couple of cans of gas, still sealed, in one of them. A rare find, one I wasn't about to pass up. I siphoned what I could into my canister and moved on before the feeling of being watched became too much to ignore. That's the thing about being out there, you're never really alone. Even when the streets look empty, even when the only sound is your own footsteps, you can feel it. Like the world itself is aware of you, waiting to see what you'll do next. Maybe it's paranoia, maybe it's instinct, but either way, it keeps you sharp, keeps you alive. The further I went, the more the landscape changed. The buildings thinned out, replaced by fields dotted with skeletal trees. It was almost peaceful in a way, but even that kind of peace feels wrong now. Every gust of wind through the grass sounded like footsteps. Every rustle in the trees made my hand tighten on the handle of my axe. You can't afford to trust the quiet, not for a second. The moment you let your guard down is the moment you'll regret it. And then there was the bridge, an old steel structure, its beams rusted and creaking with every step I took. Below it, the river churned, dark and swollen from the rain that had passed through a few days before. The bridge stretched for what felt like miles, its planks uneven and splintered, some missing entirely. Halfway across, I stopped and looked down. The water moved fast, carrying branches, trash, and other things I couldn't quite make out. For a moment, I wondered how many people had tried to cross that river when the world first fell apart. How many had made it, but I didn't stay still for long. You can't not out there. Standing still is asking for trouble. So, I kept going, my footsteps steady, the sound of the rushing river fading as I reached the other side. There, the trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light the gray sky offered. It felt like stepping into another world, one where the rules we used to live by no longer applied. That's where I found the first tracks. Not footprints, something else. Deep grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged through the woods. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, not softened by rain or wind. I didn't follow them. I've learned better than to chase mysteries out here. Curiosity might have kept us alive once, but now it's more likely to get you killed. Still, those tracks stayed with me, Even as I moved on, their shape burned into my mind. By the time I turned back, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the landscape. Every shadow felt alive. Every flicker of movement just out of the corner of my eye made my pulse quicken. The way back felt longer, the silence heavier. The roads I'd already traveled seemed darker, more uncertain, as if the act of moving forward had changed them somehow. When I finally reached the edges of familiar ground, I paused, took a breath, looked back at the stretch of road behind me. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder that the world is bigger than the little pocket of safety I've carved out for myself. Bigger and far more dangerous. But sometimes you have to step into that danger to remind yourself why you fight to stay alive. When you're out there long enough, you start to notice patterns. Certain places attract scavengers, both the living and the dead, while others seem to sit untouched, overlooked. Sometimes it's because they're too dangerous, other times because no one thinks to check them. That's how I found the fire station. It was tucked away, just off a stretch of road lined with cracked pavement and overgrown weeds. A hulking brick building that somehow felt smaller under the weight of the collapsing world. The front doors were jammed, probably warped from years of weather and neglect. I circled around the back, careful not to make a sound, and found an entry through the garage. The door creaked when it opened, loud enough to set my teeth on edge, but nothing stirred inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rust and old oil. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, cutting narrow beams into the shadows. The first thing that caught my eye was the row of lockers, their doors hanging open. Some still had personal items inside, helmets, boots, jackets stiff with time. It felt wrong to look at them, like I was trespassing in someone else's life. But that's what survival does, isn't it? It turns every space into a potential resource, every piece of someone else's past into something you might need to stay alive. I found the tools first. Wrenches, screwdrivers, even a crowbar that looked like it hadn't seen much use. Useful but heavy. You learn to pick your battles when it comes to carrying weight. Next was the first aid kit, tucked away in a metal cabinet near the back. It was a decent haul. Bandages, antiseptic, even a couple of syringes with something labeled in tiny, faded print I didn't bother to decipher. Medicine is medicine. You take what you can get. The real find, though, was the axe. It was leaning against the wall, half hidden by a stack of old crates. The blade was dull and spotted with rust, but it was solid. Heavy enough to make you feel like you've got a fighting chance, but not so heavy you can't swing it fast. I tested the weight in my hands, felt the balance, and decided it was worth carrying. Tools like that aren't just weapons. They're symbols. They make you feel like you've got some kind of control in a world that's taken it all away. I didn't let myself linger too long in one place. That's another rule of survival. You don't stay where you don't have to. The longer you're stationary, the greater the chances that something will notice you. I started making my way back toward the garage, careful not to disturb the piles of debris that seemed to swallow the floor. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a bundle of old clothes lying near the base of the stairs. But then I noticed the way it was positioned, the unnatural angle of its limbs. A body, I thought, and my pulse quickened. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something was off. The stillness wasn't quite still. The faintest twitch, a hand, a finger curling inward, gave it away. Lurker. My heart raced as I took a step back, my grip tightening on the axe. Lurkers are patient. They don't shuffle around like the shamblers. They wait, silent and unmoving, until something gets close enough to trigger them. This is why they're so dangerous. You don't notice them until it's too late. But I wasn't about to let this one have its chance. I moved carefully, placing each step as lightly as I could. Every creak of the floor felt deafening. Every rustle of my gear amplified in the suffocating quiet. The lurker didn't react, but I knew better than to assume it wouldn't. When I reached the door, I paused for a moment, listening. Nothing. No growl, no shuffling, just the low hum of distant wind outside. I slipped through the gap and let the door fall shut behind me, the latch clicking into place like a lifeline snapping tight. Outside, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. My hands were shaking, the adrenaline leaving my system in waves. Close calls like that always hit harder after they're over. It's not just the fear of what could have happened, it's the realization of how fragile survival really is. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and that could have been it. I looked back at the fire station, its red brick walls glowing faintly in the afternoon light. It had been a good find, better than most, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been too lucky. Places like that don't stay untouched forever. Maybe the lurker was all that was left, or maybe I'd just gotten out before the real danger showed up. Either way, I wasn't about to test my luck by going back inside. The road stretched out ahead of me, winding toward the horizon. My pack was heavier now, the weight of the axe and the supplies pressing into my shoulders. But it was a good kind of weight, the kind that reminded me why I was still moving. Each step took me farther from the fire station, but the memory of it stayed with me. The quiet rooms, the stillness of the lurker, the tools left behind by people who probably thought they'd come back for them someday. I didn't stop walking until the station was just a speck in the distance, swallowed by the same emptiness that had consumed everything else. It's funny how even the best finds can leave you feeling haunted, like you've taken something that wasn't yours to take. But in the end, survival doesn't care about ghosts. It only cares about whether you keep moving. And so I did. Out here, survival hinges on one thing above all else: instincts. You can have all the tools, all the supplies, all the strategies in the world, but if you don't listen to that little voice in your head, the one that tells you something isn't right, you're already dead. That voice saved me again in the fire station, when I almost let my guard down. Almost. I've run into lurkers before, plenty of times. They're the kind of infected that play dead until you're close enough for them to grab. They don't shuffle or growl like the others. They don't make a sound. They just lie there, waiting, silent and patient as predators. The worst part is how normal they look at first glance, like something human is still left inside them, like maybe they just need help. But you learn fast that there's nothing left, nothing worth saving. This one had chosen its spot well, tucked in a corner near the stairs where the light barely reached. If I hadn't noticed that twitch, just the barest movement in its hand, I might have walked right past it, and that would have been the end of me. I knew better, though. My pulse started racing the moment I realized what it was, my instincts kicking in before my brain could catch up. The thing about dealing with lurkers is that you can't afford hesitation. You can't stop to think, to weigh your options. You act or you die. But the problem is, acting means taking a risk. If you get close enough to strike, you're close enough for them to grab. If you try to sneak past, you might trigger them without realizing it. It's a lose-lose situation, and the only way out is to stay sharp and trust your instincts. I tightened my grip on the axe, feeling the rough wood of the handle dig into my palm. My mind was already running through the possibilities, calculating the distance, the angles, the escape routes. The fire station was too quiet, the air too thick, like it was holding its breath along with me. I crouched low, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, and began to back away toward the door. Every step felt like an eternity. The floor creaked under my boots, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. My eyes stayed locked on the lurker, watching for any sign of movement, a twitch of the fingers, a shift in the chest, anything that meant it had noticed me. But it stayed still, its body crumpled and lifeless, its face turned just enough to hide whatever expression might have been there. I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead, the tightness in my chest as I fought to keep my breathing steady. The door was only a few feet away now, its edges illuminated by the faint daylight seeping in from outside. Just a few more steps, just a few more seconds. My fingers found the edge of the door frame, and I froze, waiting, listening. Still nothing. That's the thing about lurkers, they're smart in their own twisted way. They don't move until they're sure they've got you. It's what makes them so dangerous. Most infected are predictable. You can hear them coming from a mile away, their groans and shuffles giving them away long before they're a threat. But lurkers, they know how to wait, how to let you think you're safe right up until you're not. I slipped through the door, easing it closed behind me as quietly as I could. The latch clicked into place, a sound that felt deafening in the oppressive quiet. Only when I was sure it was shut did I let myself breathe again. My hands were trembling, the adrenaline still surging through me, making it hard to think straight. I leaned against the wall outside, staring at the axe in my hands, and let the reality of what had just happened sink in. It wasn't the closest call I've ever had, but it was a reminder, a sharp, brutal reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. You don't get warnings out here. You don't get second chances. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and you're done. It's not a lesson you ever stop learning, no matter how long you've been out here. As I stood there, catching my breath, I thought about how many people probably hadn't noticed the lurker. How many had walked into that fire station thinking it was just another empty building, only to never walk out again. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The idea that death could be waiting for you in the most unassuming places, hidden in plain sight. That's what makes this world so exhausting. It's not just the infected, it's the constant vigilance, the never-ending need to stay alert, to second-guess every shadow, every sound, every still figure lying just out of reach. It wears on you, chips away at the edges of who you are until you're not sure what's left. But that's the price of survival, isn't it? The price of keeping yourself alive when everything around you is trying to drag you down. I left the fire station behind me, its red brick walls fading into the distance as I made my way back to the road. The weight of the supplies in my pack was a small comfort, a reminder that the risk had been worth it. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the lurker wasn't just another obstacle, but a warning, a reminder that no matter how careful you are, no matter how many rules you follow, you're never truly safe. Not out here. Not anymore. The further you go from familiar ground, the more you start noticing things you've trained yourself not to look for. Signs of life. Not the kind that grow back in cracks of concrete or climb up the walls of abandoned buildings. No, I mean signs of people. Real, living people. It's a double-edged sword, finding something like that. On one hand, it's proof you're not completely alone. On the other, it's a reminder of just how dangerous the world can be, even without the infected. I was cutting through a stretch of forest, sticking close to the tree line to stay out of sight. The underbrush was thick, the ground damp from rain a few days back, and every step felt like it echoed in the silence around me. That's when I saw it, a clearing up ahead, just barely visible through the branches. At first, it looked like nothing special, just an open patch of ground with a ring of stones in the center. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a clearing. It was a campsite. Whoever had been there didn't stay long. The signs were subtle, but they were there if you knew what to look for. The fire pit in the center was cold, but the ashes were still black, not yet bleached gray by time. A few empty cans lay scattered around the edges, one of them dented as if it had been tossed aside in a hurry. Near the base of a tree, I found a blanket, a small, worn thing with faded stripes that looked like it might have belonged to a child. It was damp but not soaked through, which meant it hadn't been there long. The more I looked, the more pieces I found. A plastic water bottle, still half full, with a few smudged fingerprints on the surface. A trail of trampled grass leading away from the clearing, heading deeper into the woods. And then, the most intriguing thing of all, a scrap of paper caught on a low-hanging branch. It wasn't much, just a torn corner with part of a crude map drawn in pencil. The lines were shaky, the details rough, but it was clear whoever made it had been marking something. I studied it for a while, turning it over in my hands, trying to make sense of the markings. There were circles, faint arrows, a couple of XS scattered across what looked like a stretch of road. None of it made sense to me, not without the rest of the map. But the fact that it existed at all told me something important. Whoever had been here had a plan, or at least they thought they did. The question that stuck with me was why they left. This clearing was well hidden, far enough from any roads or buildings that it should have felt safe. So why abandon it? What made them pack up and leave so quickly that they didn't take their blanket, their water, their map? The answer wasn't hard to guess. Something spooked them. And out here, there's no shortage of things that can do that. I thought about following the trail. It wasn't hard to spot. The grass flattened and broken where someone, or several someones, had hurried through. But something held me back. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the quiet that seemed to hang over the clearing, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Whatever it was, it kept my feet planted where they were, my eyes scanning the trees for movement. The truth is, finding other survivors isn't always a good thing. People out here are desperate, hungry, scared, and fear makes people do things they never thought they were capable of. I've seen it before. The way a person's eyes can shift, the way their body tenses when they realize you have something they want. Sometimes it's food or water. Sometimes it's just the safety of knowing you're not a threat. But desperation has a way of turning even the best intentions into something ugly. So, I stayed where I was just long enough to take in the scene and commit it to memory. The clearing, the fire pit, the blanket, the map. They all painted a picture of someone who was trying to hold on, trying to survive in a world that doesn't make it easy. But they weren't here anymore, and that was all I needed to know. Before I left, I picked up the blanket. It was small, light enough to fold and tuck into my pack without adding too much weight. Maybe it would come in handy someday, or maybe it was just my way of holding on to a piece of whoever had been here. A reminder that even in the midst of all this, there are still traces of humanity to be found. As I made my way back toward the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the infected, I would have heard them. This was different, subtler, the kind of presence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I didn't look back. There's no point in it, not out here. If someone was watching, they'd either make themselves known or they wouldn't. All I could do was keep moving and hope that whoever left that clearing behind was still out there, still alive. The clearing stayed with me long after it disappeared from sight. The images burned into my mind like photographs. The fire pit, the blanket, the map. They were pieces of a story I'd never know the ending to. But that's how it is now, isn't it? We're all just fragments, scattered across a world that doesn't care whether we come together or fall apart. And sometimes all you can do is move on and hope the next piece you find doesn't cost you more than you can afford to lose. The infected have always been predictable, or at least that's what I've told myself. It's easier to think of them as mindless, stumbling, groaning shadows of what they used to be. Shamblers, runners, lurkers, they fit into neat little boxes, categories I've come to understand and expect. But the thing about expectations is that they lull you into a false sense of control. And control out here is an illusion. I saw something a few days ago that I can't explain. I was on my way back from the fire station, taking the long route to avoid some debris-choked streets. The road wound through an old industrial area. Rows of warehouses and factories, their windows shattered, their walls streaked with rust and grime. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you second-guess every step. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just another group of shamblers. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, moving in the same direction down the middle of the road. Nothing unusual about that. But then I noticed the way they were moving. It wasn't random, wasn't the aimless staggering I've come to associate with their kind. They were together, close together, keeping a steady pace as if they were aware of each other, as if they were working together. I stopped where I was, ducking behind a rusted-out car to watch. My first instinct was to assume it was a trick of the light, some coincidence of movement that my mind was turning into a pattern. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became. They weren't just moving in the same direction. They were following each other, their heads tilted slightly as if they were listening to something I couldn't hear. One of them, a tall figure with a torn jacket hanging off its skeletal frame, paused and turned its head. The others stopped, too, almost in unison. It was subtle, but it was there, that flicker of coordination that sent a chill down my spine. And then they started moving again, all at once, as if some unseen signal had told them to go. I stayed crouched behind the car, heart pounding, until they disappeared around a bend in the road. The idea of infected working together isn't new, not entirely. I've heard stories, half whispers from other survivors, fragments of conversations picked up over broken radio signals. Most of the time, I've dismissed them as exaggerations, the kind of tall tales people tell to make sense of the chaos. But seeing it for myself was different. It wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was happening right in front of me. I've spent the last few days trying to make sense of it. Are they evolving, adapting, or have they always been capable of this and we just didn't notice? It's not like we've had the luxury of studying them up close, not without risking everything. But the thought that they might be changing, that they might be learning, it's a kind of fear I wasn't prepared for. Because if they're learning, what does that mean for the rest of us? It's one thing to face something predictable, something you can outsmart or outrun. But if they're starting to think, to act with purpose, then the rules we've been living by are worthless. And out here, the rules are all we have. I keep replaying the moment in my mind, the way they moved, the way they stopped and started as one. It felt deliberate, almost tactical. But then I remind myself that I could be wrong, that my own fear might be shaping what I saw. It's easy to let your imagination run wild out here, to turn every shadow into a threat, every sound into a warning. Still, I can't shake the feeling that something's shifting, that the balance we've been clinging to is slipping away. I haven't seen anything like it since, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Maybe it was a fluke, or maybe it's just the beginning of something bigger. Either way, it's a reminder that nothing out here stays the same for long. The infected don't care about what we think we know. They don't care about our rules or our expectations. They'll keep changing, keep adapting, because that's what survival demands. And that's the part that keeps me awake at night. Not just what they are, but what they might become. The infected were once us, after all. Flesh and bone, driven by hunger and instinct. If they're evolving, it's only because they were human once, and humans have always been good at adapting. Too good. I've started being more careful, more deliberate in how I move. Avoiding open spaces, sticking to shadows, doubling back to make sure I'm not being followed. It feels like paranoia, but it's better than the alternative. Because if I'm right, if they're changing, then staying ahead of them won't just be a matter of instinct. It'll be a matter of strategy, of thinking not just about what they are now, but about what they might be tomorrow. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. The thought that no matter how hard we fight, no matter how much we adapt, they'll always find a way to catch up. They don't get tired. They don't stop. And if they're working together now, what's to say they won't get better at it? Smarter, faster, deadlier. The road ahead feels narrower than it did before. The walls closing in just a little more with every step I take. But stopping isn't an option. Not for me. Not for any of us. Because whatever's coming, whatever they're becoming, we can't afford to let it catch us standing still. Not now. Not ever. Surviving out here isn't about the big, dramatic victories. It's about the small, practical decisions, the little things that don't seem like much until they're the difference between life and death. You learn quickly what matters and what doesn't, what to keep and what to leave behind. And more often than not, it's the simplest things that end up saving your life. Take rope, for example. It's not glamorous. It doesn't have the same immediate utility as a weapon or food. But it's one of those things you never appreciate until you need it. I found a coil of it in the fire station, tucked away in a dusty corner like an afterthought. It was frayed in places, stiff from age, but still strong enough to hold weight. I almost left it behind, thinking it would just add to the load I was already carrying. But something told me to take it, and I'm glad I did. Rope isn't just rope out here. It's a lifeline, a tool with 1,000 uses. You can use it to secure a shelter, to climb out of a tricky spot, or even to set a trap if you're clever enough. It doesn't take up much space, doesn't make noise, and it lasts longer than most things we have left. It's the kind of item that seems trivial until the moment you don't have it, and by then, it's too late. Then there are the tools, screwdrivers, pliers, wrenches. They're not flashy, but they're invaluable. I've used a screwdriver to open locked doors, to dismantle electronics for spare parts, even to defend myself in a pinch. Tools like that don't just make survival easier, they make it possible. They let you adapt, improvise, Find solutions when the world throws something new and dangerous your way. But here's the catch. You can't carry everything. There's a balance you have to strike, a constant calculation of weight versus utility. Every item you pick up is something else you might have to leave behind. Food and water are non-negotiable. Weapons, too. But everything else? That's where it gets tricky. You have to think ahead, consider not just what you need now, but what you might need tomorrow or next week. It's a lesson I learned the hard way. Early on, I used to carry as much as I could, stuffing my pack with anything that seemed remotely useful. Spare clothes, extra batteries, books, even sentimental items like photographs and trinkets. It made me feel prepared, like I was holding onto a piece of the world that had been lost. But it didn't take long for the weight to catch up with me. Every step felt heavier, every mile more exhausting. And when the time came to run, I couldn't. That was the first time I had to leave things behind. It felt like tearing pieces out of myself, watching those items hit the ground, knowing I'd never see them again. But survival doesn't care about sentimentality. It doesn't care about the past. It only cares about whether you can keep moving forward. So I learned to pack light, to focus on the essentials, to let go of everything else. Now, every item I carry has a purpose. The rope, the tools, the first aid kit, they're not just things. They're options, choices. They give me a way out when the walls start closing in, when the infected are too close, when everything feels like it's falling apart. And out here, having options means having hope. It means knowing that no matter how bad things get, you're not out of moves just yet. Even something as simple as duct tape can be a game changer. I've used it to patch up gear, to reinforce barricades, even to make a splint for a sprained ankle once. It's not pretty, but it works. That's the thing about survival. It's not about elegance. It's about function, about finding ways to make the broken pieces fit together, even when it feels like they never will. But the most important thing I've learned is this. It's not the gear that keeps you alive. It's what you do with it. You can have all the tools in the world, but if you don't know how to use them, or if you freeze when the moment comes, they're just dead weight. Survival isn't about what you have. It's about how you think, how you adapt, how you stay one step ahead of everything that wants to tear you down. So, the next time you're out there, scavenging through the ruins of what used to be, pay attention to the small stuff. Look for the things that seem insignificant, the things you might not think to take. Because more often than not, it's those little things that will end up saving you. Not the big, obvious finds, but the quiet, unassuming tools that let you keep moving when the world tries to stop you. And if you're carrying something that doesn't serve you, something that weighs you down more than it helps, don't be afraid to let it go. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's necessary. Survival demands sacrifices, and sometimes that means leaving behind the things you thought you couldn't live without. But you'll find new tools, new gear, new ways to keep going. Because that's what survival is, isn't it? Finding a way, always finding a way. There's a certain kind of quiet that comes with this world, a silence so deep it feels alive. It's not like the quiet of a peaceful evening or the stillness of a snowy morning. This quiet crawls under your skin, wrapping itself around your thoughts, weighing down every breath. It's the kind of silence that presses in on you, amplifying every tiny sound until it feels like the whole world is listening. When you're out there, the quiet is always waiting. It waits in the empty streets, in the abandoned buildings, in the stretches of road where the only movement comes from the wind. At first, it seems like a gift, a break from the chaos. But that's the trap, isn't it? You let your guard down, think you're safe, and that's when it strikes. The quiet isn't peaceful. It's predatory. I've walked through towns where the silence felt heavier than the air itself. Houses with broken windows and open doors, their insides stripped bare by looters long gone. Streets littered with debris, each piece a remnant of a life left behind. A stroller tipped over in the gutter, its wheels bent and rusted. A jacket draped over a fire hydrant, faded and stiff from the elements. These are the signs of a world that stopped moving, stopped breathing. And yet, in the quiet, it all feels alive. Like the town itself is watching you, waiting to see what you'll do. The worst part is how the quiet makes you doubt yourself. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves becomes a question. Was that me or something else? You start to second guess every step, every sound, until the silence feels louder than any scream. It's a kind of madness, really, the way it gets into your head, making you hear things that aren't there, see shadows where there are none. But sometimes the quiet isn't playing tricks. Sometimes it's a warning. The infected don't make noise unless they want to. They don't call attention to themselves unless they're sure they can catch you. And when they're quiet, when they're lurking in the shadows or lying still among the debris, they blend in so well you'd swear they weren't there at all. That's when the silence becomes a weapon, a trap you don't even know you've sprung until it's too late. I've learned to move through the quiet like a ghost, my steps deliberate and measured, every movement calculated to make as little noise as possible. It's not just about staying hidden, it's about staying in control. The silence tries to own you, to wrap around you like a shroud, but you can't let it. You have to push back, claim your space, remind yourself that you're still alive. There's an art to listening in the quiet, to picking out the sounds that matter from the ones that don't. The faint crackle of broken glass underfoot, the distant flutter of a bird taking flight, the uneven rhythm of footsteps that don't belong to the living. It's a skill you develop over time, one that becomes as instinctive as breathing. And it's what keeps you alive when the quiet tries to take you. But the quiet doesn't just hide the infected, it hides everything. The world is full of noises we've forgotten how to hear. Branches swaying in the wind, water dripping from a cracked pipe, the hum of distant machinery still clinging to life long after the people who built it are gone. These sounds are small, insignificant on their own, but together they create a tapestry, a map of the world as it is now. And if you know how to read it, it can guide you through the silence. Even so, the quiet takes its toll. It wears you down, eats away at your resolve. There are nights when it's so oppressive I can hardly sleep, every creak and groan of the station settling into my bones like a warning. And during the day, when I'm out scavenging or moving between safe spots, it follows me like a shadow, always just a step behind. The quiet is relentless, unyielding. It doesn't get tired, doesn't stop. It's always there, waiting for the moment you're too tired to fight it. That's the thing about the quiet. It's not just out there. It's in here too, inside your head, inside your heart. It feeds on your fear, your loneliness, your doubt. It makes you question everything. Why you're still moving, still fighting, still breathing. It's a battle that never ends. One you have to fight every second of every day. And the worst part, it's a fight you have to win alone. But even in the quiet, there's something that keeps me going. A spark, a whisper, a reminder that the silence doesn't have to win. That as long as I'm moving, as long as I'm listening, as long as I'm alive, the quiet can't take everything. Can't take me. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. The thing about seeing signs of other survivors is that it always feels like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's proof you're not the last one standing, not the only living thing left in a world overrun by the dead. On the other hand, it's a reminder that not all dangers out here come with rotting faces and broken teeth. People can be just as deadly, just as unpredictable, and sometimes even worse. I've seen signs before, scattered footprints in the mud, a can of food cracked open and left behind, the faint smell of a fire that had burned itself out hours before. Each time, it sets my heart racing in a way nothing else does. Because when you see those signs, you can't help but wonder who left them. Are they like you, just trying to survive, looking for some scrap of normalcy in all this chaos? Or are they something else entirely, the kind of people who've decided that survival isn't about holding on to humanity, but about taking whatever they can, however they can? I came across something like that recently. I was moving through a residential area, the kind of neighborhood that probably used to be full of barbecues and birthday parties, kids riding bikes in the street, parents mowing their lawns. Now, it's a skeleton of what it used to be. Overgrown yards, cars rusting in driveways, doors left swinging open like invitations to ghosts. I wasn't planning to stick around long, just passing through on my way to the outskirts, when I spotted it. A house smaller than the others, with the windows boarded up from the inside. That's not unusual in itself. A lot of people tried to barricade themselves in when everything first started falling apart. What caught my attention was the pile of fresh wood outside, the neat stack of planks and nails that hadn't been there long. Someone had been working on reinforcing the place, and recently. That alone was enough to make me pause. I didn't go in. I didn't even get close. The moment you step into someone else's territory, you're inviting trouble. But I stayed just long enough to take in the details. The way the boards were nailed unevenly, like whoever put them up was in a hurry. The faint tracks in the dirt leading from the house to the street and back again, the tread patterns suggesting more than one person. And most telling of all, the way the air around the place felt different. Charged, like it was waiting for something to happen. I left as quickly and quietly as I could, my mind racing with questions. Who were they? What were they protecting themselves from? And more importantly, what would they do if they saw me? People don't reinforce houses like that unless they're scared, unless they think someone or something is coming for them. And fear like that doesn't leave room for trust. That's the problem with other survivors. They're unpredictable, desperate, and desperation makes people dangerous. I've seen it too many times to count. The way fear can twist someone, turn them into something they never thought they'd be. It's not their fault, not really. The world we're in now doesn't leave much room for kindness or generosity. But that doesn't make it any easier to deal with when you come across someone who sees you as a threat, or worse, as an opportunity. And yet, there's a part of me that can't help but hope. Every time I see those signs, an abandoned campsite, a trail of footprints, a boarded-up house, I feel that flicker of something I can't quite shake. It's the same thing that keeps me broadcasting, even when I don't know if anyone's listening. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there's someone out there who hasn't let the world break them completely. Someone who's still holding onto a piece of what it means to be human. But hope is dangerous, isn't it? It makes you take risks you wouldn't otherwise take. It makes you second-guess your instincts, push boundaries you've set for yourself. I've learned to keep my hope in check, to treat it like a spark instead of a flame. Because as much as I want to believe that there are still good people out there, I know better than to count on it. The truth is, the world doesn't make survivors anymore. It makes scavengers, fighters, people who've learned to take what they need and leave the rest behind. And when you come across someone who's managed to survive this long, you have to ask yourself, what do they have to do to get here? What have they sacrificed? What are they willing to do to make sure they stay alive? I'd like to think that if I ever met another survivor, we'd find a way to work together, to help each other in a world that doesn't offer much help. But that's just a fantasy, isn't it? Out here, trust is a luxury most of us can't afford. And even if you're lucky enough to find someone who means well, it doesn't take much for good intentions to turn into something darker. So, when I see signs of other survivors, I keep my distance. I watch from the shadows, take note of what I see, and then I move on. Because out here, staying alive isn't just about avoiding the infected. It's about knowing when to walk away, when to let the signs be just signs and nothing more. Hope might get you through the night, but caution will get you through the next one. And for now, that's enough. It has to be. Survival out here is a constant game of adaptation. There's no manual, no set of rules you can rely on. The infected don't care about logic, and the world doesn't owe you fairness. Every day is a test, and the only way to pass is to stay one step ahead. That means thinking fast, moving faster, and always being ready to change your approach when the situation demands it. The first rule of survival is simple: move with purpose. Every step you take should mean something. Wandering aimlessly gets you killed. You never know who or what is watching. Stick to the shadows, hug the walls, and avoid open spaces whenever possible. The more you can blend into the environment, the harder it is for anything to find you. And don't just think about where you're going, think about how you'll get back. An exit plan isn't optional. It's a necessity. Every building you enter, every alley you cut through, every shortcut you take, you should already know how you're getting out if things go wrong. Because they will go wrong. That's not pessimism. It's reality. The only question is whether you'll be ready when it happens. Another thing people forget, patterns will get you killed. If you always take the same route, always scavenge the same spots, always leave the same way you came in, you're setting yourself up for disaster. The infected aren't smart, not in the way we think of intelligence, but they're not stupid either. They learn in their own twisted way. If they catch on to your routine, you won't even see them coming. Change it up. Keep them guessing. Keep yourself unpredictable. But even the best plans mean nothing if you don't trust your instincts. That gut feeling you get, the one that tells you something isn't right, listen to it. It's easy to ignore, to convince yourself you're imagining things, but more often than not, it's right. That feeling has saved me more times than I can count. It's what told me to duck behind a car when I saw that pack of infected moving in unison. It's what made me back out of the fire station instead of trying to fight the lurker head on. Out here, your instincts are your best weapon. Sharpen them, trust them, use them, and don't underestimate the small things. A piece of rope, a roll of duct tape, a handful of nails. These might not seem like much, but they can mean the difference between life and death. I've used duct tape to reinforce a barricade when the infected were clawing at the door. I've used nails to rig a makeshift trap that gave me just enough time to escape. Survival isn't about the big, flashy solutions. It's about the little things that add up, the small advantages that keep you alive when everything else is trying to kill you. Then there's the mental side of it. Out here, survival isn't just physical. It's psychological. The world doesn't just want your body. It wants your mind. It wants to wear you down, make you give up, make you stop thinking. You can't let it. You have to stay sharp, stay focused. That means keeping your mind busy, finding ways to occupy yourself even when there's nothing to do. Organize your supplies. Plan your next move. Count the steps from your shelter to the nearest exit. It might seem trivial, but it's not. It's how you keep yourself from slipping into the kind of despair that gets people killed. And when it comes to the infected, never assume you know what they'll do. They're not static. They're not frozen in time. They change, they adapt, and they'll find ways to catch you if you're not careful. That pack I saw a few days ago, the one that moved together like a unit, that wasn't something I was prepared for. It forced me to rethink everything I thought I knew about the infected. And that's the key. Always be ready to rethink, to adjust, to learn. The moment you stop adapting is the moment you start dying. Of course, all of this is easier said than done. When you're tired, hungry, and running on fumes, it's hard to stay vigilant. But that's when it matters most. The world doesn't care how exhausted you are, how much you've already been through. It'll keep throwing challenges at you. And the only way to survive is to rise to meet them. That's what survival is. Pushing yourself past what you think you can handle, finding strength you didn't know you had. But don't mistake survival for victory. Out here, you don't win. There's no finish line, no prize waiting for you at the end. Survival is just surviving. It's getting through the next hour, the next day, the next week. It's staying alive long enough to see what comes next, even if you're not sure you want to. And that's okay. It has to be, because out here, survival is enough. It's all there is. So keep moving, keep thinking, keep adapting. The world isn't going to stop trying to kill you, and the infected aren't going to stop changing. But you can be faster, smarter, more prepared. You can be better. And sometimes, being better is the only edge you've got. Survival isn't just about keeping your body alive. Out here, the hardest battle is the one that takes place in your own mind. The infected, the danger, the constant threat of starvation or exposure, those are all external. You can see them, prepare for them, even fight them if you have to. But the loneliness, the weight of it, that's something you carry with you every second. And it doesn't go away, no matter how far you run or how well you hide. The quiet isn't just out there. It's inside you. It creeps in when you least expect it, filling up the spaces in your head until you can't think straight. You start to hear things, voices that aren't there, footsteps in the distance, whispers that send chills down your spine. At first, you tell yourself it's just your imagination. But after a while, you start to wonder, what if it's not? What if the quiet has teeth, just like everything else in this world? That's the trick of it, isn't it? The quiet makes you doubt yourself. It makes you question your own thoughts, your own senses. You see shadows that move when they shouldn't, hear sounds that vanish the moment you try to pinpoint them. It's not the infected that get to you, it's the moments between them. The moments when there's nothing but you and your own mind, and no one to tell you whether what you're feeling is real. I've spent nights staring at the ceiling, listening to the groans of the wind outside, the creak of the station settling, the faint hum of the generator in the corner, and every sound feels like a warning, every noise a prelude to something worse. You tell yourself it's nothing, just the world doing what it does. But the longer you sit in that darkness, the harder it is to believe your own reassurances. And then there are the memories. They come when the quiet does, slipping in through the cracks like water through a broken roof. You think you've buried them, left them behind with everything else, but they're always there, waiting. A face you haven't seen in years, a voice you thought you'd forgotten, a moment that feels like it belongs to someone else's life. They don't just remind you of what you've lost, they remind you of who you were before all this started. And that might be the cruelest part of all. I keep a picture taped to the console here. It's the only one I have, the last one I managed to grab before the world went to hell. It's of my family, my mom, my brother, me. We're standing by a lake, the sun just starting to set behind us. My brother's holding up a fish he caught, grinning like it's the greatest achievement of his life. My mom's smiling too, that kind of smile that makes you feel like everything's going to be okay, even when it isn't. And me, I'm caught mid-laugh, looking as awkward as ever. That picture is my anchor, keeps me grounded when the quiet tries to pull me under. But it's a double-edged sword, because every time I look at it, I feel the weight of everything I couldn't do, the people I couldn't save, the lives I couldn't protect. It's not just grief, it's guilt. And that's a weight that doesn't get lighter no matter how much time passes. The trick to surviving the quiet is finding something to hold on to. It doesn't have to be big. In fact, it's better if it's not. A routine, a ritual, something to keep your mind occupied when the silence gets too loud. For me, it's little things, organizing supplies, counting how many steps it takes to get from one end of the station to the other, drawing maps of places I've been, even if I'll never go back to them. They're small, almost meaningless tasks, but they give me something to focus on, something to keep the quiet at bay. Talking helps too, even if it's just to yourself. Narrate what you're doing, tell stories you remember, argue with the walls if you have to. It sounds ridiculous, but it works. It reminds you that you're still here, still alive, still capable of making noise in a world that wants you silent. That's why I keep broadcasting, even when I'm not sure anyone's listening. It's not just for you, it's for me too. A way to keep the quiet from swallowing me whole. The hardest part is holding on to yourself. Out here, it's easy to lose track of who you are, to let the quiet strip away the pieces of you one by one until there's nothing left. You start to forget your own voice, your own face, the things that used to make you feel human. That's the real danger. Not the infected, not the scavengers, but the slow erosion of everything you used to be. But you can fight it. You have to fight it. Hold on to the small things. A photo, a memory, a piece of who you were before all this started. It won't fix anything. It won't make the quiet go away. But it'll remind you that you're still here, that you haven't disappeared into the silence just yet. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's all you need to keep going. Surviving out here isn't about winning. There's no victory waiting for us. No triumph to celebrate at the end of it all. Survival is just that. Surviving. Taking the next step. Drawing the next breath. Holding on to the smallest sliver of hope that there's still something worth fighting for. That's all it is. And somehow it has to be enough. I think about that sometimes. About what keeps me going. It's not the supplies I've scavenged or the station I've claimed as my shelter. It's not even the broadcasts I send out into the void, though they help more than I'd like to admit. Something deeper, something harder to pin down. A stubborn refusal to let the world win, maybe. Or the memory of what it felt like to be part of something bigger, something alive. Because that's what we're really fighting for, isn't it? Not just to stay alive, but to stay human. To hold on to the parts of ourselves that the world hasn't managed to take away yet. It's a fragile thing, humanity. It doesn't come naturally anymore, not when survival demands so much. But it's still there, buried under the fear and the exhaustion and the endless grind of just trying to make it through the day. I see it in the little things, the moments that catch you off guard. The way a stranger shared their last can of food with me once, even though they didn't have to. The way I've stopped to leave supplies in places where someone might find them, even though I'll never know if they do. It's not much, but it's something. A reminder that even in the worst of it, we're not just animals scrabbling for scraps. We're still capable of kindness, of thought, of hope. Hope, that word gets thrown around a lot, doesn't it? It's a funny thing, hope. Heavy and fragile all at once. It's what keeps you moving, even when you don't know why. But it's also dangerous. Can blind you, make you take risks you shouldn't, make you trust when you know better. And yet, without it, what are we? What's the point of surviving if there's nothing to hope for, nothing to look forward to? I don't know what's out there. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe the world is just broken, and we're all that's left, clinging to the edges of it like the last leaves on a dying tree. Or maybe there's something waiting for us, some future we can't see yet, hidden behind all the pain and loss and silence. I don't have answers. All I have are questions, and the stubborn belief that asking them is better than giving up. The infected don't ask questions. They don't hope, don't think, don't feel. They just exist, mindless and empty, driven by hunger and instinct. That's the line, isn't it? The one thing that separates us from them. As long as we're still asking, still wondering, still reaching for something more, we're not them. Not yet, but it's a thin line, thinner than most of us realize. It's easy to lose yourself out here, to let the fear and the anger and the exhaustion strip away everything that made you who you are. I felt it happening to me in the quiet moments when the weight of it all feels unbearable. It would be so easy to stop, to let the world take what's left. But then I think about the picture taped to the console, the one of my family. I think about the stories I tell myself to keep going, the memories I carry like armor, and I keep moving. That's the thing about humanity. It's not something you have. It's something you choose. Every day, every moment, you decide whether you're going to hold on to it or let it slip away. It's not an easy choice, not when the world is constantly trying to take it from you. But it's the only choice that matters, the only one that makes surviving worth it. I don't know if anyone's listening to this. Maybe I'm talking to myself, just filling the silence with my own voice. But if you're out there, if you can hear me, I want you to remember this. You're still here. And as long as you're here, you still have a choice. You still have a chance. Hold on to that. Hold on to whatever keeps you moving, whatever keeps you human. Because that's the fight. Not against the infected, not against the world, but against the part of you that wants to give up. The part that thinks it's easier to let go. It's not easier. It's just quieter. And quiet doesn't mean peace. It doesn't mean safety. It just means the world has stopped trying to pull you back. Don't let it. Don't let the quiet win. Keep moving, keep asking, keep fighting. Because as long as you're fighting, as long as you're choosing to hold on, you're still human. And that's something worth surviving for. So whoever you are, wherever you are, keep going. Keep holding on to that spark inside you, no matter how small it feels. Because that spark is everything. It's the reason you're still here, still breathing, still alive. And as long as it's burning, the world hasn't taken everything. Not yet. Not ever.